All right, it's 12 p.m. I want to welcome everyone. Welcome and good afternoon. We would like to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by Kansas State Research and Extension. My name is Jason Graves. I'm the horticulture agent here in the Central Kansas District. We're very pleased you could join us for this afternoon's presentation. We're glad this webinar series can help continue to provide education in horticulture and gardening. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or related discipline. But most of all, we all have a love for gardening and the natural environment and want to encourage you all in that as well. And each week we're featuring new topics related to gardening and horticulture, and our goal is to meet the needs of both new gardeners and seasoned gardeners. So as a quick reminder, you can find both previous and upcoming topics at our website. We'll post that link here in the chat in just a short little bit. We have also uploaded all the previous recorded webinars to the website, so hopefully you've had a chance to go back and visit any of those that you've missed in the past. And we will also be uploading this presentation to the website, and it should be available by tomorrow afternoon. As a reminder, we've also been posting these events to the K-State Horticulture and Natural Resources Facebook page. So we encourage you to like and share those events with others who may be interested. So before we get started, we just want to again remind you of a couple housekeeping notes. You'll notice that you are unable to unmute your mic, and this is just to help us keep the background noise down during the presentation for our speaker. And we usually have a lot of participants, so we appreciate your cooperation in keeping your mic muted and your video camera off just to preserve bandwidth. So as previously mentioned, we also have a moderator today. Cassie Homan, horticulture agent with the Post Rock District, will be helping us moderate. And so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to send those over the chat. And you can also send those privately to our moderator if needed. Cassie will be keeping track of the questions that come in, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can before our time is up after Jesse's presentation. So we'll do our best to get through all those questions, but if we don't get through them all, we'll be uploading those additional resources to the Kansas State Horticulture and Natural Resources website, and that's a great place to check after the presentation. So we want to go ahead and get started today, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Jesse Gilmore, who is Horticulture Extension Agent in the Wildcat Extension District, and we are looking forward to his topic today on weed management. And so Jesse, if you're there, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. If you can give us a couple minutes, just a couple seconds here, we'll make the transition for his presentation.
Should probably unmute myself before before starting the screen share. Okay, there we go. So are we good on the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes. Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
Jesse.
Okay, awesome. Thank you everyone for coming out to our Zoom meeting today for weed management in the lawn and garden. I hope everyone is staying healthy with the recent spike in coronavirus cases, and I hope that everyone is having a good time getting ready for the holiday weekend that's coming up. Like Jason said, my name is Jesse Gilmore. I am the horticulture agent for the Wildcat District in southeastern Kansas. Just wanted to give a little bit of my background really quick. I graduated with a degree in horticulture from K-State, and I've pretty much worked in every facet of the horticulture industry, including food production and landscape management in both turf and gardens. So I had a lot of different ways that I could take this presentation. I wanted to put on my food production hat. I wanted to put on my landscaping hat. And I know that there are probably a lot of different interests in how to control weeds. So this presentation is going to cover a lot of basic concepts that can apply to multiple parts of horticulture for the common homeowner. That includes food production, that includes garden beds, and that includes lawns. And then at the end of the presentation, we provide some resources for more specific information for each particular discipline. So basic concepts and control options and tips for those control options. And then at the end, you will have some resources to dive further into for your specific context. So I kind of wanted to start off by asking, what is a weed? And this is a question that has confounded people for centuries. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that it's a plant whose virtues have never been discovered. And I like that a lot because I am more pro-weed than a lot of people are in horticulture. Another common saying that you might hear about weeds is that they're plants that never learned to grow in rows. As I mentioned previously, I have a lot of different experiences in horticulture, and everyone's definition of weed is going to be different based on their particular perspective. So what is a weed to a homeowner in their yard will be different from a weed to a food producer in a small garden bed, to a pasture owner, to a cropland owner. And it also will differ based on what your priorities are for the particular horticulture context you're in. So do you prioritize having a lot of good plants for pollinators? Do you prioritize aesthetic consistency in your yard or garden bed? Do you prioritize aesthetics, plants that might look nicer than others? For food producers, do you prioritize yield over everything else? And there are many other options for priorities. The one thing that I found when talking about weed control is that your tolerance for weeds directly correlates with your tolerance for inconsistency wherever you're trying to grow plants. The more tolerant you are of having inconsistent garden beds or lawns, the more tolerant you're going to be of weeds, and the less likely you're going to be to try controlling those weeds. Plants in general will fall on a continuum. On the left is the weed that is completely undesirable. You want to control it as soon as possible. And it goes from weed to ornamental or food producer on the other side. And then in the middle, there are those plants that might have desirable characteristics. And you might want to keep them in your garden bed or lawn, but you did not put them there intentionally. So going into weed biology a little bit, as mentioned before, weed is any plant that grows where you don't want it to grow and has negative impacts on neighboring plants or aesthetics of your lawn or garden. There are three main characteristics of a weed that need to be known when determining what the best route for control is. The first is the length of life. There are three basic terms that describe how long a plant lives: annual, perennial, and in some rarer cases, biennial. Most weeds are going to fall into the annual or perennial camp. Annuals are plants that go through one growing season and then die. Perennials are plants that go through a growing season. They might die back, but they will return as the same plant the following growing season. There's also the season of growth in which the plant grows. There's cool season plants, which grow in the spring and fall, and warm season plants, which grow in the summer. And then there's the method of growth. There are many different modified stems that will have some varying effects on how you will manage them in your specific context. There's rhizomes, there's stolons, there's vines. Shrubs and trees can also be weedy. It doesn't necessarily have to be an herbaceous plant to be a weed. When I worked at a landscaping company last year in Johnson County, Kansas, the number one weed that we controlled in garden beds around our properties was maple seedlings, because of the trees that were dropping seeds into the beds that then germinated and started growing as new trees. So knowing these different characteristics for each weed that you want to control will help you determine the best management strategies. One other concept that we need to talk about is the seed bank. The seed bank can be thought of as the aggregate of every single plant seed that is viable for growth in a specific area. So in a square of lawn or in a garden bed or food plot. For new garden beds and food plots, there are a couple of things that you can do that will actually increase weed pressure on plants going forward. The first is tilling or not tilling the ground. Tilling 9 times out of 10 is going to cause more weed pressure because of the dormancy of potential weed seeds in the ground that will be broken by your disturbance of the soil. Oftentimes these seeds will be lower in the ground and will be brought up to the surface to germinate by your tilling. Another thing to consider is topsoil for new gardens. Topsoil gathered from the wild, essentially, will have more weed seeds in it than fresh soil or potting media that you might use. And on the right, there's a picture of the soil seed bank. You have seeds fall onto the ground. Some are eaten by wildlife. Some just naturally are not viable from the start. Some try to germinate, end up failing. And then what you see as weeds in your garden will be the ones that successfully germinated. And there are a lot of seeds in the ground. As mentioned previously, there are some dormancies that weed seeds might need to break before being able to germinate. The two that matter most to gardeners are going to be scarification and sunlight. Scarification is breaking a seed's dormancy by damaging its outer coat. Usually these seeds will be a lot tougher so that they can survive mechanical damage from animals or from tillers of new gardeners. The damage done by potential tilling machines will break the dormancy and allow the seed to germinate. And then sunlight is another one. Seeds that are lower in the soil profile and have a sunlight dormancy will not germinate unless brought up to the top of the soil. Seeds that fall on the ground but are outcompeted by other plants in the area also will not germinate. So if you're in a yard and you have sunlight dormant seeds that are on the surface of the soil, having a thick thatch of turf grass is going to be one management strategy for keeping weeds from germinating in the first place. And then having the seed bank and understanding what seeds might be in the ground and getting ready to germinate will also affect the control timing of pre-emergent herbicide, which we will get to in a second. I am a horticultural heretic. I love weeds. I love seeing how tough they can be and seeing a plant's hidden benefits for plants that might not be considered beneficial in other instances. And there are quite a few weed species that have hidden merits that would allow some people to feel better about keeping them in their landscape. So these are some of the pros of certain weed species. Some weeds can be used as a food source, not just by wildlife, but also by people. My personal favorite weed, and I would probably say my favorite plant in general, is the dandelion. Dandelions are incredibly good for you, and I will soapbox for that plant until I die. They have over 10% of 12 different vitamins and minerals for your daily value. And they're just fun to go out and collect, in my opinion, although I know that not a lot of people share that opinion. Weeds can also act as a beneficial insect attractor like Queen Anne's lace or yarrow. Clover in particular is a very good plant for lawns because they will fix nitrogen. They are a leguminous weed, so they will add nitrogen to the soil through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil. And that will reduce your fertilizer costs compared to not having clover in your soil or in your yard. Some weeds will function as pest prevention like alliums and ground ivy. And quite a few weeds will also attract pollinators, which is important, particularly if you want fruit trees in your area. Letting it grow is also the lowest cost and labor commitment, but That's because it's not a control option. You're not going to see a more consistent garden bed or yard if you just let weeds grow wherever they want. It's going to be more inconsistent. At high enough populations of weeds, you get potential disease pressure. This is because when plants are crowded together, the canopies of these plants stay wetter longer, and moisture, prolonged periods of moisture, will increase the chance of plants getting fungal diseases, which is 90% of the diseases that plants can get. It could also serve as a potential pest host, particularly grasses like crabgrass. And as mentioned before, it will serve as light, water, and nutrient competition for any more desirable plants in your landscape. And some weeds can also cause allergies in people. So if any one of these cons outweighs the benefits of having the weeds, you're going to want to try controlling them. And so we come to the control options for weeds in your lawn and garden. There's going to be 3 general demographics that these control options can apply to. There's going to be people who are growing food plots. There's going to be people who have ornamental garden beds, and there are people who have lawns. And not all, or each control option will apply to different groups, and some control options will not apply to all of them. So these will be labeled as we go forward, and I'll kind of point them out and walk you through them, which control options apply to which groups of people. So you have basically 6 control options when it comes to keeping weeds out of your lawn or garden. 2 of them will remove the weed, and 4 of them will prevent the weed from coming back in the future. You can pull or damage it. You can spray it with a post-emergent herbicide. You can put down landscape fabric or mulch. You can add ground cover plants that will cover the soil and prevent them from growing, or you can use pre-emergent herbicide. Okay, pulling or damaging. This can be done by any group of people: food plot owners, garden owners, or lawn owners. I include damaging along with pulling because most of the time it's going to be mechanically damaging the plant instead of pulling it out completely. Unless the root system is very shallow, there's always going to be something left over. There are a couple pros to pulling and damaging. The first is that it's good exercise and that it's the cheapest form of control aside from letting it grow. But as previously mentioned, that's not a control option. And also you can be selective in what goes and what stays if you decide that some weeds are desirable, but not others. There are some cons. The first is that you must be physically able, and some people with limited mobility will not be able to bend over and pull weeds or use a hoe to basically cut the weeds off from the root. Time commitment can be high, especially with large swaths of weeds or weeds that are spread out from each other. Some weeds, like dandelion, will not pull easily with their deep taproot, and pulling some weeds with specific growth habits will make weed infestations worse. You see this a lot with rhizomatic plants like wild strawberry, Bermuda grass, and wild violet. These plants spread underneath the ground, and in some instances, they will root at places where the damage occurs if you don't pull out the entire plant all at once. And then they can send out new plants from those roots. So pulling Bermuda grass is not really a decent option for control. On the right is a picture of a triangle hoe. The other option that applies to all 3 groups of people will be spraying it with a post-emergent herbicide. Usually this will be the fastest and most effective control method unless you come up with a weed that develops some herbicide resistance, which can happen, but is not as common in horticulture contexts as it is in agronomy contexts. It's also the easiest control method for those with limited mobility who still want to have a nice looking garden or lawn. There are some cons though. You need to be careful that you don't have wind drift onto desirable plants because that can cause some herbicide injury if the herbicide is designed to control a certain type of plant. broadleaf or grass. Then you have ornamental grasses. If you're spraying to kill a grass and it drifts over onto your ornamental grass, will kill that too. There are potential health side effects without the personal protective equipment outlined in the label, and we will get to pesticide labels here shortly. There's also potential herbicide resistance, as mentioned before, but that is less common in horticultural contexts. And if mistimed for the application and you apply before a rain, the herbicide can run off to stormwater or to other plants in the area that you didn't mean to control. Landscape cover and fabric is specific to food plots and garden plots, garden beds, excuse me. The pro is that it's nearly impossible for weeds to grow through. There are slight differences in different materials for landscape cover and fabric, depending on what you want to pay for and the type of material that you want for the bed. There are some cons though. In my experience, landscape fabric is incredibly labor intensive to put down. It is hard to remove once installed if you need to change something about your garden bed or food plot. It usually degrades. Plastic landscape cover will degrade in sunlight, and fabric landscape cover will degrade in water. And plastic doesn't allow for a lot of water infiltration into the soil, which can cause some drought conditions in desirable plants. Mulching is one of the most popular ways to control weeds because of the customizable colors and materials that you can use for mulch beds. It helps retain moisture in the soil longer, so it actually has the opposite effect of plastic landscape cover. It keeps soil temperatures cooler. Certain materials of mulch have pest repellent properties, such as cedar chips. And it protects surface roots from mechanical damage. If you're mowing around a tree or using a weed whacker to take particular grasses down a level, mulching will minimize the damage to surface roots. Could, if damaged, allow infiltration of disease. There are a couple of cons, but in general, mulch is one of the more beneficial ways of weed control. Colors fade over time, so we'll occasionally need to replace the mulch if that is a concern. Mulch can serve as a potential disease host if they remain too wet for too long. Mostly that will be molds. There are some molds that will affect mulches that are not disease causing, but are still aesthetically detrimental to your garden bed or food plot. These are specifically called slime molds or dog vomit molds. They are incredibly rare in my experience. I've never seen one in person, but there is still the possibility of those showing up. It washes away without strong garden infrastructure. So as you can see in the picture, there's a landscaping stone bed around these trees, and the infrastructure is the wall holding all of the mulch in place. And mulching tree is a very delicate process. In a lot of cases, people will pile mulch up around the base of the tree in what's known as a mulch volcano. Tree roots need oxygen, and when they are buried under a significant amount of mulch, like you would see with tree volcanoes or mulch volcanoes, the roots will start tunneling towards the surface in search of oxygen, and if they start wrapping around the base of the tree, they can choke a tree to death. This is what's known as stem girdling roots. And is why mulching properly and understanding the technique for mulching is so important in trees in particular. You won't see that as much in herbaceous or garden plants, but it is still important to understand that these plants also need oxygen for transpiration, and so will search out oxygen if they can't get it in the soil they grow in. The second to last control option is ground cover plants. This also applies to food and garden growers. They're incredibly low maintenance to establish. You have a lot more aesthetic consistency in ground covers because they usually are spreaders and will take over an entire bed, which can be a plus or minus depending on how diligent you are in controlling them. And there are many plant possibilities for ground covers. One of my favorites is garden thyme, the herb, because it is a spreader and you get some culinary use out of it. It's also tolerant of moderate foot traffic. But cons are that they can quickly become invasive. Most of them will be spreaders, and in particular, vining ground covers like winter creeper and vinca and Virginia creeper will grow anywhere. If they meet something that they can grow up, will. I have winter creeper in my backyard that was initially put down as a ground cover and is now circling up the trees. And the thickness of the vine on the tree is about as big as my fist. So these plants can get out of control very quickly, and you need to make sure that you are diligent in keeping them where you want them. If you put ground covers down, oftentimes it will prevent other desirable plants from growing in addition to weeds. And if weeds do grow through the ground cover, it's harder to remove or kill the weeds with sprays. It's not impossible, especially if, for example, you have grasses growing in a vinca bed. You can choose a grass selective herbicide to spray that will kill the grasses you see, but won't harm the vinca in any way. The last control option is for lawns. I know I was kind of neglecting lawn care people there for a second. Pre-emergent herbicides are by far the most neglected but easiest way to control undesirable weeds in your garden or lawn. How these herbicides work is that they will form a layer essentially of crust in the top inch or so of soil, and any seeds that try to grow through that will be scorched as they do. Some will survive, but most will not survive the scorching, and you will see a much lower population of weeds wherever you put this down. You can often find them in fertilizer herbicide mixes. So while you're putting down fertilizer in your lawn or garden, you can also get a pre-emergent herbicide in that will prevent weeds from growing. It reduces the chance of seeing weeds in the lawn and garden, and it also reduces the viable seed bank because you have more, you have a deficit of weeds essentially. More weeds are dying that are being put in because as they try to germinate, they end up failing. The cons are that once applied, desirable seeds will not grow. So you need to apply this after you seed your yard and have the seeds germinate and get to a certain height so that they don't experience the same scorch that weed seedlings will do. But this scorching is the same reason why pre-emergent herbicide is not feasible for a vegetable plot or a food plot because not most of the time vegetables will be germinated or will be propagated by seed. And if you have that layer of chemical in the top inch or so of soil, your vegetable seeds will also be scorched. It's not a selective herbicide. And it is also timing dependent. It won't stop seeds that will have already emerged from the soil after you apply it. So if you apply late, you run the risk of having a higher weed population just because of the seeds that have already germinated. There are a couple of other niche control methods that I won't go into too much detail on, but it's important to know. Cover crops are a control method in large acreage. Typically in food plots, you'll see plants like buckwheat, you'll see rye, you'll see other edible grasses like barley. And the idea for this is to build up the soil, but it is a very niche control method in horticultural contexts. Compost is used more as a nutrient source than as a weed suppressor. It can also function as its own type of mulch, but because compost can harbor seeds from weeds that have been thrown into the compost pile, if you do not get those compost bins hot enough to basically terminate the seed, those seeds still can be viable, and placing compost in garden beds or in vegetable plots will provide them an opportunity to germinate once again. There are options like pouring boiling water on weeds. This is not feasible in large quantities, obviously. It is useful for the most problematic weeds. I've used this on poison ivy in my backyard. It is, however, not feasible for large swaths of weeds. So you can use that, but target the most problematic weeds like any of the poisons, poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac, or any plants that cause allergies, ragweed, stinging nettle, green plants with thorns, greenbrier, weeds like that. Okay, so now that we've gone over the control methods, you know what you have and how it grows, essentially. You know how you want to control the weeds. What are some tips to each management strategy to allow weed control to go smoothly? So letting it grow. I know I said I was going to talk about control methods, but I want to bring this up one more time. Understanding which weeds become invasive and targeting those for control will improve your relationship with weeds, as well as keeping weeds thin enough to prevent disease pressure and significant competition. If you are interested in eating weeds, I've been doing this for a while now. It helps to have a recipe that you want to use your weeds in before harvesting. For the more common edible weeds like dandelion, purslane, and lamb's quarters in particular, those are the big three. There are many different cookbooks that will have a section dedicated to edible weeds now. And if you use them in, will increase your chance that you enjoy eating these wild plants in your backyard, and make it more likely that you will continue. Never eat a plant that you cannot 100% identify, though. I had a very scary run-in with poison hemlock, not eating it, but just in general, you know, understanding toxic plants and what they can, you know, look like or where they can be. Usually you will not see toxic plants in homeowner situations aside from the poison ivy, oak, and sumac trio. If you have any questions about identification, contact your local extension agent. They would love to help you investigate that. And introduce plants into your diet slowly if you do start eating weeds out of your backyard. Just because even though it is edible, you don't know how your body is going to react to it. So giving your body a chance to acclimate to this new food will reduce the risk of stomach issues if you eat something that doesn't agree with you. So tips for pulling and damaging plants. The first is to use the right tool. There are 4 general groups or categories of tools that are used to remove weeds. There's the shovel or spade, there's the hand trowel, there's hoes like the stirrup and triangle hoe, and the soil knife. If you do not have a soil knife, you definitely need to get one. Soil knives are hands down the most useful garden tool you can have. It functions as a cutting tool, it functions as a digging tool, and it functions as a measuring tool. You can see a soil knife on the right. You will not regret getting one. Pulling is always going to be more preferable than mechanically damaging, especially if you are fighting perennial weeds, because mechanically damaging a plant that will come back means that you're going to have to fight it multiple times before you can reduce the energy stores in the plants enough to where it just dies. Usually with annual weeds, you can get away with mechanically damaging it via a hoe. But knowing the difference between perennial weeds and annual weeds will help determine whether it is better to pull or mechanically damage it. In my experience, a stirrup hoe will always be better than a triangle hoe because you don't have to cut as deep to separate the plant from its roots. Hoes are not digging implements, they are cutting implements. They're designed to basically separate the above ground portion of the plant from its roots. And stirrup hoes have always been easier to use because you don't have to go as deep or swing it to damage the weed, essentially. You do have to make sure in either case, if you're using a hoe, to keep the blade sharp so that it is not a huge effort in order to do that. As I mentioned before, composting weeds can be an issue if you are not diligent about turning it and keeping it hot enough. My recommendation would be to not compost any vining weed, because vining weeds are much better at putting down adventitious roots and growing in the compost pile. And then knowing what plants are thorny and what plants cause rashes. Use gloves if you do want to pull or damage those, so that you're not getting stuck or getting a rash from these weeds. Okay, so for spraying, lawn owners in particular really like spraying herbicide on their lawns in order to control broadleaf weeds. And my recommendation would be to attempt cultural control first. There are a lot of different lawn management strategies that can help reduce weed populations without needing to spray. In general, in particular, mowing, keeping your deck at a higher, keeping your mower deck at a higher level will increase the competition from your turf grass and reduce the chance of those sunlight dormant seeds in the seed bank being able to germinate and having to fight them after they germinate. Also, watering more infrequently. Some people overwater their lawns, and this can cause the seed bank to explode with germination. And also fertilizing in the right amounts in the right time. Getting a soil sample done with your local extension office will help determine what, if anything, needs to be applied to your lawn to keep them healthy, and also when to apply them so that the grass gets the most benefit out of it. If you're applying fertilizer when the grass is about to go dormant, obviously any plant that's not grass and is not going to go dormant will benefit more from that. Also, you want to choose a selective versus a non-selective herbicide in yards. Non-selective herbicide, the most common one is Roundup, obviously. Roundup will kill anything it touches, which increases the chance for drift. You do want to be very careful with Roundup that you're only spraying what you want to kill. Selective herbicides are better options for lawns because it will target only broadleaf weeds without targeting the grasses. Putting a pre-emergent herbicide down at the beginning of spring will help you get the advantage in your weed fight. And lastly, the label is the law. Follow any direction the label has on it, and always label to confirm that the weed you want to control is there, because if it's not there, then then the chemical you want to buy and use is not proven to control the plants you have. That the plants you're applying herbicide to are labeled as safe from harm. That you're legally allowed to apply the herbicide. In some cases, herbicide application is restricted to people with commercial licenses because of their toxicity to wildlife or potential for extensive ecological harm if misapplied. The rate at which you should mix the chemical for proper application, any protective equipment you need to wear while spraying the weeds, and toxicity to bees and aquatic wildlife. In general, herbicides are not going to be particularly toxic to bees, but if they are, then you want to make sure that you're not applying them to flowering weeds when bees are active in order to keep our pollinators healthy. So here at the end, I chose 6 weeds that you would commonly see in lawns and gardens that I feel have enough merits to keep around. Dandelion, clover, milkweed, purslane, amaranth, and plantain. You can see their pictures along the bottom in that order. Dandelion in particular, I'm sticking up for it again. It's a benefit for wildlife. Sparrows in particular eat the seeds, so it's not necessarily something you're going to see spread in your lawn. There's also the edibility and the pollinator issue, or the pollinator benefits. Clover in particular is one weed that I don't understand the fight against, particularly because it is a nitrogen fixer and it is a great pollinator for bees. You will get a lot of nitrogen benefit out of keeping clover in your yard, and you will have less fertilizer costs. And then milkweed, purslane, amaranth, and plantain. More niche weeds, but weeds that have enough benefits as well. And then on the opposite end, my 6 killer weeds, weeds that you should get rid of in every single instance you find them. Field bindweed is my least favorite plant ever. It will wrap around anything it can climb up, and oftentimes it is a pain in the butt to remove if you if it ends up wrapping around, for example, food plants or ornamentals. In yard context, it's not as big of a deal, but in gardens and food plots, it's the worst. In yard contexts, crabgrass is likely going to be the worst weed that you encounter. There is no real benefit to having crabgrass over anything else, and it is a bear for visual inconsistency. Obviously, any of the poison species like ivy, oak, or sumac, you want to get rid of as soon as possible to avoid the rashes. Ragweed is a very tall plant that can outcompete other neighboring plants and causes a lot of pollen allergies in the spring. Yellow nutsedge is another visual inconsistency plant. It is not a grass. It is just a very grass-like weed. There are two chemicals in particular that control nutsedge. I will post them in the chat at the end if people are interested, because yellow nutsedge is a very common weed throughout all three different contexts. And then greenbrier is a thorny vine that you don't want to grab accidentally. Okay, so we've reached the end of the talk. Here's a list of resources for particular questions that you might have. I would definitely recommend getting in contact with your local extension agent. They can help you with any questions you might have. We do have a pesticide label safety garden hour webinar on July 22nd, specifically for using herbicides and insecticides. So if you have any questions about that in particular, I would highly recommend registering for that one. A couple of KSU publications, specifically for weed control in lawns and garden tools, and two publications from other universities. We also have websites. The first website is the bee toxicity database. You just go into this and you put whatever chemical you want to apply. It can go by either common name or trade name, and it will tell you its relative toxicity to bees and whether or not you should apply them to flowering plants. There's also the KSU Lawn Problem Solver and KansasHealthyYards.org. And then for books, if you're interested in foraging in your backyard, there's Backyard Foraging by Ellen Zakos. And then for weed identification, there's Weeds of the Midwestern United States and Central Canada. This is primarily for field weeds, but I have used it more in horticultural contexts than field weeds. This was the copy I got for my weed science class back in 2013, and I have kept it around ever since. There is also Weeds of the Great Plains, put out by the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. I don't like this one as much, but it also has a ton of good pictures if you are a visual identifier. Okay, and with that, I will take any questions.
All right. Well, we want to thank Jesse and just appreciate your presentation. That was a lot of good weed information to think about, I think, for all of us, thinking about some of the beneficial aspects and then some of those weeds we do want to control. So we're going to encourage you to go ahead and post your questions, and we've already got many questions in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cassie, who is moderating, and we will cover as many questions as we can up until 1 o'clock. Thanks, Cassie.
All right, thank you, Jesse. That was a great presentation. The first question, and I don't know if this would be for you or more for like our crop agents, but someone wants to know, is it true that Roundup is sprayed on wheat in Kansas a few weeks before harvest for weed management?
That I don't know. I know that I don't think there is a Roundup Ready wheat variety. Roundup Ready is basically a gene that provides resistance to the chemical glyphosate, which is the common name of Roundup. If there is a Roundup Ready variety, that is possible, but if not, then the Roundup would kill the wheat too. So I would probably doubt it, because I don't think I have heard of a Roundup Ready wheat variety. But that would be something to ask your local extension agent.
Okay. This person wants to know, what does ground ivy inhibit? So I think they're asking like what weeds it can.
They're asking specifically for insects that it repels. I do not know that off the top of my head, and that's a question I should have expected. In general, the aromatic plants like ground ivy are just going to be a general pest inhibitor. It's not something that specifically targets certain pests. Ground ivy is one of those tricky plants because while it does have that pest repellent aspect to it, it is also pretty prolific in its spreading. It is not something that I think would merit keeping on its own unless you really keep on top of preventing its spread to other parts of the garden or lawn. I don't know specific pests though. I'm sorry.
Okay, does vinca coexist well with hostas and other shade perennials, or should it be held back from invading garden beds?
Most of the time when I saw vinca in my landscaping experience, it was around really large plants like trees. Low to the ground perennials like hostas are riskier to put in spaces with vinca. That's not something I would honestly recommend doing. I've never seen vinca climb up perennials like that, but that's not to say that it doesn't happen. So I would keep it on its own if I could.
Okay. Is it harmful to a tree to have ivy or other ground covers climbing the trunk?
No, with a huge asterisk. So ivy and other vining plants are going to put out little aerial roots called holdfasts, which essentially cling to whatever it's climbing up and keep it stable. This can be a problem if the vine starts wrapping around a tree. So like I mentioned, my trees in my backyard, winter creeper is so noxious. I would never recommend planting it. I'm probably going to have to use a chainsaw to cut through the vine at the base so that it dies in the tree. And if it starts wrapping around that tree, it can choke it out entirely. And the added weight, if it climbs up high enough, could result in limb breakages. For buildings and structures, in general, not going to be an issue. If you have brick, I have seen instances where the holdfasts will start tunneling into the mortar between the bricks. It's not something that's ever really happened in any great capacity, but that is something to keep in mind. They will find their way through small spaces. So if you have like small areas where parts of buildings don't meet up, Virginia creeper found its way into my garage, my detached garage through the roof. So that is also something to keep in mind. But in general, no, I would tend towards recommending to keep it off the tree just to be safe though, or tree or structure.
Okay, thank you. What can kill trumpet vines as they're coming up everywhere, even up trees and fences?
Oh my gosh, trumpet vine is on my top 5 hit list for plants. So I had to deal with this at my parents' house. My mom planted trumpet vine because she liked the flowers, and now she's having the same issue. At my best case scenario for trumpet vine, find every place where it's coming out of the ground, cut it off 2 to 3 inches above the ground, and then apply a herbicide called Tordon or Tordol. Is it Tordon or Tordol? I think it's Tordon with an N, Tordon, to the wound with a Q-tip. And what that is it's a systemic herbicide specifically for woody plants that will be translocated throughout the rest of the plant and basically kill it back to the roots. It's something that you will likely have to do multiple times to, keep ahead of any potential trumpet vine that comes up that's new. But that, in my experience, is the best option. You do have to be careful with Tordon, though, because it can harm any plants growing in the soil of anywhere it spills, which is why I recommend the Q-tip method, because you have a lot better control of where the herbicide ends up going. And that you can find at any general hardware store or garden center. It's very common.
All right, someone is interested in knowing what is the perfect layer of mulch. How thick should a mulch layer be?
Around plants, it becomes trickier because you don't want to pile it up at the base. I do not know off the top of my head. There is research that has been done on amounts of mulch. I did not look that up before the talk. My gut is to go with somewhere around 2 to 3 inches of mulch, except for around the base of trees, and kind of thin it out to maybe 1 inch. But I do not know that for a fact.
Okay, what is the best way to control or eradicate bindweed?
My question would be whether or not it's growing near other plants, because if it's not, I would just spray it with Roundup. That is one plant I never tolerate, and usually I tend away from spraying because I am one of those weirdos who likes pulling weeds, but bindweed I just don't mess with. I would recommend finding some spray that is labeled to be applied for any plants that might be around the bindweed you want to kill, and going for that particular herbicide. On the label, there should be, in most incidences, at least for horticultural herbicides, a list of plants that won't be damaged. And sometimes it's not as simple as, oh, this is a broadleaf herbicide, so it's going to kill all broadleaves. There are some broadleaf plants that will show resistances. So if you want to do it that way, that would be my recommendation.
Okay, and I did just realize Brooke put a blog post in the chat about controlling bindweed. So if you are interested in that, for people that ask bindweed questions, please go check out that blog post. Okay, Jesse, someone asked, how long does a pre-emergent last?
It depends on a couple of things. It depends on the application rate for the particular product you're applying. We made 2 applications of pendimethalin, which is a pre-emergent herbicide, usually in pelleted form, early in the spring last year. So, and then we didn't apply any more pre-emergent herbicide after that. So it should last the entire growing season. You might need 1 reapplication, but in general, it's going to last long enough to where your desirable plants, if it's in a garden bed, are going to outcompete any weeds that you have. Or if it's in a lawn, long enough to where you get to the dry part of the season, or to the dry part of the year.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked, how do you eliminate poison ivy or oak over a large area?
Your best option would probably be to spray it. I'm not sure exactly what is around this poison ivy that you might want to protect, but spraying it dead is the best option. You have the removal at that point that is still going to be an issue from the urushiol oil, but it should not get any worse at that point. I would suggest probably Roundup for that too.
Okay, sounds good. And this one's kind of an interesting question. I'm not sure if you will know, but it says years ago, KSU was experimenting on a device that would apply steam to a lawn to kill weeds. Was this ever developed?
There are I believe, machines that do that. I don't think it was ever KSU's machine. And I'm not sure how recommended that would be in terms of use, but I'm fairly certain there are machines out there that do that.
Okay. How would you control weeds and moss that grow in the seams of a brick patio? Any suggestions for preventing the growth over the course of the summer?
Brick, more than most other building materials and like garden or lawn and garden infrastructure, is going to be very, you see people apply Roundup quite a lot. And I would say that if you want to kill the weeds back to the roots, that would be the option. That would be the way to go. For brick, it's not as big of a deal when you apply it because the brick is going to reflect a lot of heat from the sun and dry the herbicide faster. It's the drying of the spray that essentially causes the chemical to enter the plant and kill it. So you want to make sure that you apply it on a hot day where the chance of it running off or going somewhere else in your area is low. I would also recommend a hoe, particularly a triangle hoe for this. I prefer stirrup hoes, but in this particular context, triangle hoes would be more effective if you want to basically have a flat surface in the brick.
Okay, we probably have time for a couple more questions. Someone wants to know, why is Lawrence in Northeast Kansas having a bumper crop of oak tree seedlings? Why doesn't mowing kill the oak seedlings?
So I can answer that second one easy. Oak seedlings are very hard to kill off by mechanical damage because they have those energy reserves in the nut, which is essentially its seed. And so that can provide for multiple emergencies during the growing season. One recommendation I would have for controlling oaks is that they are broadleaves and you have a turfgrass lawn. So find a selective herbicide that will kill broadleaves and spot treat anywhere that has an oak seedling that you want to get rid of. We had, one property that had maybe 2,000 2,500 oak seedlings in his yard. And after we sprayed, it was completely gone. So spraying it with a selective herbicide is probably the best bet for control. My best guess for why they are showing up is because of how wet it's been just over the last year or two. That increases the chance for germination. I can't think of any particular other reason why oaks would be so prolific in their germination.
Okay, thank you. Okay, someone says they have an area of about 20 foot long that has mullein or foxglove growing on the side of the driveway in a mostly shaded area. It's now 7 foot tall. We live on 5 acres of native wooded land. Will the foxglove become invasive in our woodlands, or should we let it be and enjoy the flowers and pollinators?
My gut says no, foxglove is not invasive, but I would ask your local extension agent for that.
Okay. When and with what can established buffalo lawns be sprayed with to kill native grasses and also dandelions?
You're not going to be able to find a spray that will control particular species of grasses and not others. Grasses, more so than broadleaf herbicides, will be all-inclusive for what they control. So if you have a grass herbicide, it's going to control the grass you want to keep in addition to the grass you want to get rid of. There's no good option for controlling it by spraying, but what I would recommend is seeding the lawn again with the grass that you want to keep and essentially outcompeting the other grasses you don't. For dandelion, any broadleaf herbicide, selective broadleaf herbicide should be able to control it.
Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up.
All right. Yes. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for the Garden Hour series. Glad you could be here to learn about weed management with us today. We have, as a reminder, several more webinar series coming up, so be sure to visit that website, the H&R website again, to see all the upcoming topics. Reminder, this session will be posted there by tomorrow afternoon. And you'll also receive an email with a survey. And so we would appreciate it if you'd fill that out and provide your feedback as well. So if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at ksuemg@ksu.edu. So we want to thank you again. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.
Enjoy the holiday.